Mob atmosphere debunked. On Leo Frank's behalf, Lewis Marshall claimed to the highest court that his trial was, quote, dominated by a mob which was hostile to, end quote, him, quote, and whose conduct intimidated the court and jury and unduly influenced them, and neutralized and overpowered their judicial functions, end quote. The term, quote, mob, end quote, was carefully selected by Frank's defense and strategically placed in both his legal filings and public relations onslaught. Its definition as, quote, a riotous or disorderly crowd of people or rabble, end quote, denotes danger, but is yet less declarative than the specific and unprovable charge of, quote, anti-Semitism, end quote, the charge in which pro-Frank writers have trafficked since the trial's end. The claim of anti-Semitism never made it into any of Leo Frank's voluminous legal filings. Instead, Frank pushed forward individuals who claimed to have witnessed mob-like behavior in and around that Atlanta courtroom. An examination of those claims, however, finds that those supposed mobs were described in very un-mob-like terms, as having variously, quote, applauded, end quote, quote, hurrahed, end quote, quote, whispered, end quote, quote, shouted, end quote, and, quote, cheered, end quote. Not terms used to characterize bloodthirsty, lynch-ready, anti-Semitic rioters. And curiously, many of those witnesses claiming to have freely intermingled with the pogromic mobs of anti-Semites had such Jewish surnames as Hazan, Lipschitz, Borston, Rosinski, and Sherman. B. S. Lipschitz says he was, quote, mingling with the crowd, end quote, not the, quote, mob, end quote, but, quote, the crowd, end quote, which is defined as merely, quote, a large number of persons gathered together, end quote, most often at sports or entertainment events. Mingle is defined as, quote, to circulate among a group of people, for example, guests at a party, end quote. None of the voluntarily mingling, quote, witnesses, end quote, reported being threatened, attacked, lynched, or even insulted for their Jewishness, and none were ever known to have faced any form of retaliation for signing their names to such treasonous claims in the heart of Jim Crow Georgia. It is also difficult to imagine that a Jew, in such an environment of, quote, mobbish anti-Semitism, end quote, could be moved, as Frank's mother was, to curse the prosecutor in open court, calling him either a, quote, Gentile dog, end quote, or a, quote, Christian dog, end quote, before getting up and walking out of the courtroom and into the public street. Her outburst did not set off the kind of retaliatory pogrom one might expect against the Jewish section of the city if the dire assessments of the trial atmosphere were true. The anti-Christian Jewess reappeared in the courtroom the next day, unafraid and unassailed. In fact, it was this Jewish woman's bigoted utterance that introduced Frank's religion into the trial. At one point during the trial, dozens of Jewish character witnesses from all over the United States descended upon the Georgia court, not one of them charging mistreatment by any Georgian Gentile, much less abuse by a, quote, mob, end quote. Frank's own 4-hour-long trial statement, which he gave without allowing the state to cross-examine him, should have induced any mob to virulent demonstration. Yet the description of the courtroom by the Atlanta Constitution reporter tells a different story. Quote, a hush settled over the room throughout his recital, and he was able to talk in an ordinary voice and make himself heard all over the place. End quote. With evidence of his guilt mounting, the facts badly failing him, his defense fizzling into fiasco, Leo Frank only then made his Jewishness the centerpiece of his defense. And only then did the, quote, mob dominance, end quote, claim become a last desperate hope. The U.S. Supreme Court saw no merit in any of Frank's claims, and on April 9, 1915, upheld the guilty verdict and death sentence by a vote of 7-2, just as the 13 previous courts had done. Governor John M. Slayton saves his own client. Quote, I have had many people to comment to me about this depraved, brutal, and criminal Negro, whom Dorsey represented as being an ordinary, innocent, country darky. End quote. Governor John M. Slayton. On April 9, 1915, nearly 2 years after the murder of Mary Phagan, the United States Supreme Court rejected Leo Frank's last appeal. He was then scheduled to hang by the neck on June 22nd. He had delayed that final decision longer than anyone ever had, but it could not have come sooner for the mass of Georgians who fully believed Frank's execution would mean justice for Mary Phagan. Frank and his attorneys, however, had a formidable ace up their sleeve. Just 1 day before Frank's scheduled execution, and 5 days before the end of his term, Georgia Governor John Marshall Slayton stepped between Frank and the hangman's noose and commuted his sentence to life imprisonment. It was a move that infuriated Georgians and ended Slayton's political career. He is cast by Frank's supporters as the cool head, the one wise and courageous truth-seeker that saw the obvious innocence of Leo Frank, and acted bravely to save the life of a persecuted Jew. But Slayton had an open secret that cast serious suspicion on whether his motives were altruistic at all. John Slayton was a well-connected Georgia politician, with a lengthy resume at the top of Georgia politics. He had held several elective offices beginning in 1896, including Speaker of the Georgia House of Representatives, 1905 to 1909, and President of the State Senate, 1909 to 1911, before serving 2 terms as governor, 1911 to 1915. By the time his fate was placed before the governor, the duly convicted Leo Frank had become an international cause célèbre. Thanks to an unprecedented and massive public relations campaign initiated by Albert Lasker and Adolph Ochs, all eyes were fixed on Georgia, and every one of those eyes believed Frank to be the victim of a gross anti-Semitic injustice. Petitions from citizens and letters from celebrities and national and world leaders poured into the governor's office, all demanding that Slayton use his power to free Leo Frank. Lasker and Ochs had no such power in Georgia, however, where most citizens believed they were the victims of an insidious plot hatched by Frank's forces to maneuver the convict to escape justice. Governor Slayton then called for yet another round of hearings, at which both the prosecutor Hugh Dorsey and Frank's advocates argued the case yet again. Slayton reasoned that, quote, new evidence, end quote, not available at the trial had to be considered. But the clemency hearing apparently was just for show. A mere charade. The decision to commute Leo Frank's sentence was negotiated possibly months before it occurred. For Slayton was concealing a secret that undermined the legitimacy of this unusual hearing. Slayton was a partner in the very law firm that defended Leo Frank. Just a few weeks after Frank's indictment in 1913, Slayton's law firm, Slayton & Phillips, merged with the firm Frank had hired, that of Luther Z. Rosser and Morris Brandon. Slayton was just about to assume the office of governor, and Georgia law prohibited a sitting governor from practicing law. So this fortuitous merger at this strangely convenient moment in time suggests that Frank's defense attorneys were planning for the eventuality that the life or death of their client may come to depend on gubernatorial intervention. By all legal and ethical standards, this brazen conflict of interest required that Slayton rescue himself from the responsibility of passing final judgment on his own client, especially given that his term in office was set to expire on June 26, 1915, and the messy fallout from his actions would then end up in the lap of the incoming governor, Nathaniel Harris. Frank's backers believed that Harris was convinced that Frank had murdered Mary Phagan, and so they pressured Slayton for immediate action before his term ended. All these forces were in play when the Frank team hurriedly moved the case through the state's pardon process and into the hands of teammate Governor John M. Slayton. As previously stated, Slayton is favorably portrayed by Frank partisans as a true crusader for human justice. In reality, Slayton is not known to have lifted any of his 10 congressional, senatorial, or gubernatorial fingers to help the innocent black men and women of Georgia, who, all throughout his political career, were being openly tortured, burned at the stake, and hanged from trees by murderous mobs of whites. Under his watch, there were no investigations, no official inquiries, no special prosecutors, no hearings, no trials. Since the beginning of 1915 to the moment of commutation in June, 2 unidentified black men and a woman were lynched in Monticello. Peter Morris was lynched in Arlington. A.B. Culberson was lynched in Evans. Caesar Sheffield was lynched in Valdosta. Samuel Heavens was lynched in Toccoa. When, a year earlier, Slayton was begged to stay the unjust executions of 3 black men, John Pashaw, Robert Hart, and Will Hart, Slayton utterly refused. Pashaw had confessed to the crime and said that the Hart brothers were not involved. Slayton said that the jury had made its decision on the case, that the men had been represented by the ablest counsel in the county, and that he would not intervene. And thus, all 3 black men were hanged. Only Leo Frank seemed to have excited Slayton's moral conscience. On June 21, 1915, Slayton commuted Frank's death sentence to life in prison, but, tellingly, he would not sign a full pardon. Nonetheless, Georgians made no distinction. Slayton's commutation of Frank's sentence was to them a blatant capitulation to the Jewish pressure campaign, the ultimate betrayal of their judicial process. Even those scholars who consider Frank innocent question the sequence of events that saved him. Nancy McLean targets the, quote, immense amounts of money and power, end quote, marshaled on Frank's behalf, and she admits that, quote, the governor did yield to this power and override the authority of a duly constituted jury, end quote. Steve Oney states unequivocally that the Georgia governor was justly criticized, quote, for an undeniable conflict of interests, end quote. And Leonard Ginnerstein admits that, in one sense, the Georgians protesting Frank's commutation, quote, were correct, end quote. A, quote, poor man would not likely have had friends who could finance successive judicial appeals and promote the national outcry that forced Governor Slayton to spend 10 days reviewing the case, end quote. And other powers, which have now come to light, seem to have influenced Slayton's behavior. As Georgia's chief executive officer, Slayton was believed to have sought loans for the state in the New York offices of Jacob Schiff, the influential banker of the mammoth financial firm Kuhn and Loeb, to whom Lewis Marshall had appealed on Frank's behalf. The investment bank had announced a gigantic $135 million loan fund to finance cotton growers in the South, $100 million coming from non-cotton growing states. Schiff wrote letters seeking assistance for the condemned B'nai B'rith leader, and is said to have asked Slayton about his view of the Frank case, even implying that the state's financial future depended on his answer. In fact, correspondence dating from 1915 reveals the beginnings of an unusually warm personal relationship between the 2 men, in which the banker alludes to financial commitments that he made to Slayton. By January of 1916, Schiff and Slayton were arranging dinner parties between themselves and their wives, and in one handwritten letter to Schiff, Slayton expressed his, quote, deep appreciation, end quote, for Schiff's assistance in an unstated matter. This was soon followed by other letters in which they discussed the suitable moment for Schiff to replace one law firm with Slayton's firm for work with an important client. There is even correspondence between Schiff and Frank's attorney, Lewis Marshall, in which they discuss Schiff's suggestion that Slayton be appointed to the United States Supreme Court. The timing of these letters, commencing right after the Frank commutation, and all discussing ways in which the Georgia governor might enhance his financial fortunes, is no coincidence. In June of 1916, Jacob Schiff began pressing the Democratic Party to replace President Woodrow Wilson's vice presidential candidate in his upcoming re-election campaign. About a year earlier, the Atlanta Constitution was trumpeting William Randolph Hearst's, quote, plan to back Slayton for the Senate or vice president, end quote. The article attributed Slayton's emergence as the favored VP candidate to his action in the Leo Frank case, which, despite having ruined him politically in his home state of Georgia, the paper predicted, quote, will redound for, end quote, Slayton's, quote, betterment and ultimately will result in a boom of countrywide proportions for Slayton as Democratic candidate for vice presidency, end quote. All in all, the political stars, as a direct result of his commuting the death sentence of Leo M. Frank, seemed to be aligning for John Marshall Slayton. This collection of correspondence and the choreographed political involvement of major world players like Marshall, Schiff, Hearst, and Wilson can only be interpreted as prima facie evidence of Slayton's reward for Leo Frank's commutation. Can it be doubted that Slayton would have made provisions for himself and his family before committing to an act that nearly 100% of his constituents vehemently opposed? And can it be doubted that such provisions would have to be arranged by those wealthy and fanatical forces who alone would benefit from that controversial action? Despite his bold act of defiance, Slayton's commutation order itself reveals that he may not have wholly believed in Frank's innocence. Slayton wrote that he believed that the Supreme Court, quote, found in the trial no error of law, end quote, and had, quote, correctly in my judgment, end quote, found, quote, that there was sufficient evidence to sustain the verdict, end quote. In fact, Slayton could have pardoned the convict outright, but he instead felt that life imprisonment represented justice, a sentence also reserved for convicted murderers. Slayton also addressed the claim of an, quote, anti-Semitic mob, end quote, surrounding the courtroom pressing to lynch Frank, a claim that remains one of the pillars of the Leo Frank legend. Quote, no such attack was made, and none was contemplated, end quote. He countered that Jews were highly respected and appreciated in Georgia because they had been prominent and even, quote, conspicuous, end quote, contributors to the history and development of the slavery-dependent Jim Crow state. As stated, Slayton justified his decision to commute, not on any flaw in the court proceeding, but on the basis of, quote, new evidence, end quote, much of which was produced by the disgraced detective William J. Burns. Referring to the counterfeit, so-called Carter letters, Slayton wrote in language almost directly lifted from the Frank team playbook. Quote, the evidence shows that Conley was as depraved and lecherous a Negro as ever lived in Georgia, end quote. Slayton's order is further tainted by his acceptance of Frank's racial paradigm, twice stating that the murder notes were written in, quote, a Negro's handwriting, end quote, and referring to Frank's helper as, quote, the Negro Conley, end quote. Had Slayton used the term, quote, the Jew Frank, end quote, his bigotry would have been self-evident. Slayton's order may have momentarily saved Leo Frank, but the governor and his family were run out of Georgia, he becoming the first governor in American history to call the National Guard for his own protection. It would be years later that he slinked back into town and practiced at the law firm rebranded as Rosser, Slayton, Phillips, and Hopkins. In the end, Slayton never realized the benefit he had expected and was promised. His Supreme Court appointment hopes were dashed almost as quickly as they emerged. Jacob Schiff apparently asked Lewis Marshall to pursue that line, but Marshall was quick to respond to Schiff in a private letter, clearly unwilling to advocate for a man for whom he had little professional respect. Quote, I must confess that I am unable as a lawyer to say that he, end quote, Slayton, quote, is the man whom I would select as a member of that exalted court, End quote. Slayton was left to traffic in the same racism that upheld his unremarkable political career. In a telegram sent from his exile in San Francisco shortly after the lynching of his client Leo Frank, he wrote, quote, "My action," end quote, commutation of Frank, quote, "protected every white farmhand and white mechanic in Georgia from the conflicting prejudice of a drunken criminal Negro." End quote. Slayton continued to follow the case, bitterly hoping for some proof that his treasonous action was justified. He is found writing to Adolph Ox in 1919, prodding him to report on the recent arrest of a Jim Conley for an alleged burglary. Quote, "Of course," end quote, he wrote, quote, "Any man willing to commit burglary would commit murder. I have had many people to comment to me about this depraved, brutal, and criminal Negro whom Dorsey represented as being an ordinary, innocent, country darky." End quote. Treating me white. Frank's semi-idyllic life in custody. Quote, "He was then dressed in stripes and given the prison number 965. He will be put to work as a common field hand." End quote. Atlanta, Georgian, June 21st, 1915. Quote, "Under the laws of Georgia, all able-bodied male convicts are sentenced and worked on the chain gangs of the different counties." End quote. Governor Nathaniel E. Harris. Quote, "My life here must be kept quiet." End quote. Leo M. Frank in prison. A prison cell in the American South is no place anyone wants to be, and the prison system in Jim Crow Georgia had a particularly nasty reputation for violence and cruelty. Medieval dungeon conditions, dank and filthy overcrowded cells, vicious, sadistic jailers, ball and chained convicts in striped overalls, and hangman's ropes at the ready were the actual conditions faced by Georgia's overwhelmingly black inmates. The state operated its chain gangs in a manner indistinguishable from actual slavery, with captives housed and transferred from worksite to worksite in the kind of rolling metal lattice cage used for zoo animals. Georgia had pioneered the use of torture methods such as waterboarding, described in an 1870 official report thus, quote, "Pouring a stream of water into the mouth of a convict stretched on his back. Much of it got into the lungs, and at best it produced a fit of choking." End quote. The ultimate purpose of this treatment was to keep blacks terrorized, submissive, and serviceable to the dictates of white supremacy. Their incarceration had nothing to do with their supposed criminality, but instead was a direct reflection of the state's labor needs. Douglas Blackman, author of Slavery by Another Name, is very clear on that point. Quote, "And the truth was that in most places in the South there was almost no criminal activity, almost no arrests, except at a time when one of these large industrial interests or commercial interests needed labor. And when that was the case, local sheriffs would begin these aggressive roundups." End quote. Captured black men in leg manacles worked on public road-building projects as state-owned slaves, under the whip of an overseer. When Floyd County's black convicts refused to work under these desperate conditions, they were whipped until they relented. It was reported in the newspaper not as an outrageous violation of human rights, but as proof to the readers that the authorities were effectively doing their job. If prejudice and bigotry are anywhere in the South, they are in its prison systems, and one would expect that its fiendish administrators would be overjoyed to get their hands on a convicted child murderer and suspected molester of white adolescent girls. New York lawyer Arthur Garfield Hayes fancifully imagined the harrowing scene. Leo Frank, quote, "was subject to constant and daily torture from the other prisoners, who, whatever their crimes, detested this northern Jew, degenerate and child murderer." End quote. It is with that horrifying backdrop that we now examine the incarceration of Leo Frank in the state of Georgia. Upon his indictment and while on trial, the B'nai B'rith leader was held at the Fulton County Tower Jail in Atlanta, and the newspaper accounts began to describe conditions that have never before or since been applied to any form of incarceration in America. Frank, quote, redecorated, end quote, his cell. Quote, seeing to it that the floors were polished, the walls scrubbed, and 2 chairs and a table installed, end quote. Officials allowed him to accept his visitors, quote, in the jailer's dining room on the 1st floor, end quote, where his friends and family brought him his, quote, papers and delicacies, end quote. Not unapprovingly, the Atlanta Constitution ran the headline, quote, cell of Leo M. Frank, now like living room, end quote. Quote, the cell of Leo M. Frank in the tower is fast assuming the appearance of a living room. Yesterday, a new bed and a number of furnishings arrived. All the day, prison attachés worked renovating the interior, oiling the floor, and cleaning the windows. Heretofore they, end quote, Mrs. Frank and her husband, quote, have accepted the use of the jailer's dining room on the 1st floor, end quote. A Constitution writer reported that Frank, quote, takes regular daily exercise, spends much of his time walking, and, at specified times, is granted the privileges of the runway alongside his cell, where he finds freer walking. What spare time he finds when not talking to visiting friends, the prisoner devotes to his mail and to the newspapers, by which he keeps well posted on all important topics of the day. End quote. Frank's father-in-law brought him breakfast every day, quote, which usually consisted of cantaloupe, rolls, and coffee, end quote. And his wife brought, quote, hors d'oeuvres and fresh Georgia peaches, end quote, before he took his daily meetings with his business partners. Dinner arrived at 1:30 p.m., and his wife joined him for supper at 4. He welcomed his friends in his, quote, parlor, end quote, most evenings, and on most days studied the issues surrounding his case. The Atlanta Constitution further explained, quote, Frank's latest method of amusing himself in his prison cell is to solicit the autograph of every visitor. He is insistent on this point before he will see anyone, it is stated, and it is estimated that he has already accumulated hundreds upon hundreds of signatures. He is keeping a diary of each day's happenings and faithfully sets down every detail of each hour, end quote. He, quote, settled in to what seemed like a pleasant routine, end quote, and even carried on a card game by mail with the bridge writer for the New York Times. His cell was filled with letters from vacationing friends traveling in exotic locations. He exercised with a set of dumbbells and read the morning paper in his robe. A reporter wrote, quote, Leo Frank's cell was a mecca for visitors yesterday. Friends came to the jail in crowds, appearing as early as daybreak and as late as 10 o'clock at night. He occupies an entire cell block in Ward 3. End quote. Frank was not even handcuffed as he was brought to and from court for his murder trial. This was so unusual that Sheriff C. Wheeler Mangum had to issue a public explanation of the practice. Jewish newspaper legend Abraham Kahan visited Frank in jail, probably expecting Frank to have been thumbscrewed in dungeon-like squalor. Quote, the neighboring cells, 6, were empty. As I immediately realized, the sheriff had intentionally not placed other prisoners there, in order for Frank to feel more comfortable, and to be able to have friends visit because the sheriff, a man named Wheeler Mangum, was convinced that Frank was innocent, and he did everything so that Frank's life in captivity would be easier. He had also permitted him to bring his own bed and bedding from home. One of the cells was larger than the others, and the Franks and their guests used it as a parlor, sitting or standing and speaking through the bars. Only Mrs. Frank was permitted by the sheriff to go inside his cell. The rest of the visitors used to stand outside in the open parlor. Mrs. Frank used to spend entire days there in his cell. I jokingly remarked about the 7-room apartment that Frank rented here, and he laughed heartily. End quote. Thomas E. Watson revealed that Frank even, quote, spoke of his separate room and the Negro convict who had been detailed to wait on him, end quote. It appears Leo Frank, a convicted murderer, actually had a black servant. Immediately after his sentence was commuted by Governor Slayton on June 21, 1915, Frank was relocated to the state's high-security Milledgeville facility, where he, as convict number 965, enjoyed what could only be called spa-like comfort. Modern showers and other conveniences that were not even in the homes of most law-abiding Georgians were provided to white inmates at Milledgeville. The surroundings, says Oni, were, quote, actually lovely, end quote. Quote, terraced into the rolling landscape while tall pines lined the road, end quote. Macon, Georgia, Telegraph. Quote, beyond a doubt, some of the people in that prison are in better living surroundings than they were before they went there, end quote. Frank had 5 hours of unspecified, quote, daily chores, end quote, and the rest of the day free, one day writing 16 letters, 18 the next. His letters during the first few weeks at the prison farm, wrote Leonard Dinnerstein, quote, resemble those from a child vacationing at a summer camp, end quote. In one, Frank writes, quote, we get the finest Alberta peaches and watermelons here grown on the farm. The apples are stewed for me. I also sleep well, end quote. The gifts poured in to Frank's gated countryside abode: an Ingersoll watch, a shaving mirror, a box of cigars, chocolate cake, books aplenty, a footlocker that, quote, overflowed, end quote, with tins of crackers and sardines, packs of cigarettes, and gum. According to Frank, a Mr. Alford, quote, brought me toilet and shaving articles including bath and face towels, end quote. He received a shipment of phonograph records, which he played on the warden's own Victrola machine. He was exasperated one day, complaining, quote, you know, I have so much mail and I like to keep things clear and orderly, end quote. Frank sat at, quote, a big roller-top desk, end quote, where he spent his days preparing his correspondence. He accepted both cash and checks at Milledgeville and received daily deliveries of both the Atlanta Journal and the New York Times. He was even able to offer postal services to his wife back in Atlanta. Quote, let me know if you need some stamps and I can send you some so you can write to me, end quote. And there's this one he penned about his universal health care plan. Quote, Dear Lucille, I am having plenty of fresh air, sunshine, and exercise. I am doing no work and will do none until I am physically fit. The physician sees me every day. I forgot to tell you to include 2 or 3 dozen handkerchiefs in the package you express me C/O Warden, end quote, J.E., quote, Smith. Also, a couple pair of my lightweight pajamas. I had 5 visitors today, all prominent men from Milledgeville and all very friendly to me. One of these men sent me a sack each of oranges and lemons. After a day or two, I will speak to Warden Smith about you and my parents paying me a visit. I am fondly your honey. End quote. Frank appears to never have had to suffer prison food. A Mr. Wall, quote, so kindly brings my dinner, end quote. At one lunch, his menu consisted of, quote, muffins, asparagus, and kippered herring. The last 2 were canned goods and tasted very fine, end quote. He wrote one day that, after light duties, he had settled into a breakfast of, quote, biscuits, eggs, and buttermilk, end quote. Frank couldn't have been happier, especially after, quote, the houseman gave me a new, cotton, mattress, which is 100% better than the one of grass which I had, end quote. Whatever Milledgeville's maitre d' couldn't provide, Frank simply requested of his wife. Quote, I will need a soap container of enameled ware or celluloid to be sent with the other things, end quote. And, quote, 5 sets underwear, end quote, and, quote, 6 pair socks, end quote. But, quote, not silk, end quote. He cautioned. Dinnerstein described Frank's prison experience as, quote, a semi-idyllic life, end quote. To his attorney, Luther Rosser, he wrote, quote, the warden and his staff are very kind and solicitous. I have several hours a day for reading, writing, or any reasonable form of exercise and diversion. The sunshine and atmosphere here are great. I have plenty of opportunity to view plant life, and my field observation in the crimino-psychological field is practically limitless, end quote. The warden is, quote, a fine fellow, end quote, he wrote to his wife. Quote, I know you will like him, end quote. To others, he gushed. Quote, the warden and his staff here are very kind to me. I know I shall get along nicely with them, end quote. To his wife, he wrote what no black man could ever write from a Georgia penitentiary. Quote, this morning I had a talk with Judge Davidson of the Commission and the warden. They are both my friends and will do all in their power for my best interests. The officials are very kind and thoughtful. I think the prison commission will order, on request, that every courtesy be shown you and the family. Warden Smith would do this anyway, as he is every inch a true blue Southern gentleman, end quote. As for the warden, he indignantly and deceptively warded off public suspicions of frank favoritism. Quote, I swear that this is one place where money doesn't count, and I'll prove it to the world, end quote. Frank is not known to have spent a single moment in a striped prison outfit or in hard labor of any kind. And finally, the greatest compliment of all. Frank wrote a letter to his lawyer explaining with evident satisfaction that the, quote, warden and his staff have treated me white, end quote. Nowhere, in the annals of the history of blacks in the American penal system, or, for that matter, in the general American population, is there a comparable experience as that enjoyed by the man who had actually been convicted of child murder, Leo Frank. And while Frank was, quote, treated white, end quote, blacks were treated black, black, black. In the very same Milledgeville prison that accorded Leo Frank such lavish accommodations, 140 blacks, including 21 boys, were crowded into one 50 by 100-foot room of a barn with no toilet facilities and no sewers. According to a report, quote, the feces and urine are deposited in buckets kept in the overcrowded sleeping quarters, end quote. The drinking water was contaminated by, quote, excrement and other matter from the tuberculosis hospital, end quote. Prisoners had to share 110 bunks, and a sizable group of inmates suffered from typhoid fever. It took 30 years after Frank's prison stay for a court to condemn Georgia's chain gang system as, quote, cruel and unusual punishment, end quote. And less than a decade after Frank's time in the pen, the local drugstore in Milledgeville greeted its customers with a macabre countertop display. A large alcohol-filled bottle in which was preserved the fingers and ears of 2 blacks recently lynched. An inscription beside the bottle read, quote, what's left of the niggers that shot a white man, end quote. This astounding disparity in the treatment and living conditions of Jews and blacks is ignored by scholars of the Leo Frank case. Frank himself understood his treatment to be extraordinary, so much so that he actually warned his wife about revealing too much about it. Quote, you know that a good deal of my life here, for the present, has to be guided in such a way as to allay public animosity and criticism. You will, I know, realize that the contents of my letters and my life here must be kept quiet. Instead of fanning this matter now, we want to let it lie dormant for the present, so that the Georgian people can get back to normal, end quote. Frank's sanctuary was violently disrupted on the night of July 17, 1915, when a fellow white inmate named William Crean snatched Frank from his slumber and stabbed him in the neck. Crean was rumored to have told Governor Nathaniel E. Harris that he cut Frank's throat because Frank, quote, had tried to sodomize him, end quote. Frank's medical treatment was immediate and thorough, and while being nursed back to health, he was attended to by skilled physicians. An office was made over just for the medical treatment and care of Leo Frank. The incident and his recovery were reported in great detail by the Atlanta newspapers. Within hours, the state prison board was proposing resolutions to investigate the negligent use of butcher knives at the prison, and a subcommittee was formed to investigate the assault. The Atlanta Journal published a photograph of the exterior of the prison building where the assault occurred, and another of the dormitory area itself where Frank had been confined. Governor Harris and other officials actually visited the prison themselves just to see about the condition of Leo Frank. Crean was interviewed by the governor, who sought the reason for his actions. According to the American Israelite, on his visit to see Leo Frank, Governor Harris was, quote, shocked, end quote, by conditions at the prison and said he intended to pardon a large number of the convicts confined there. The, quote, governor was so deeply affected by the sights he witnessed that tears rolled down his cheeks as he talked about them, end quote. How frightening must have been the conditions for blacks such that the leader of the state with the most lynchings could be brought to tears. The committee soon reported, quote, we find that it is nothing short of savagery to work these convicts these long, hot days, compelling them to sleep at night in a veritable oven, ill-smelling and beyond description, end quote. They concluded that all other inmates at the prison were being denied, quote, humanitarian treatment, end quote. Be with us again next time when we present the next chapter of The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews, Volume 3. The Leo Frank Case, The Lynching of a Guilty Man. Prepared by the Historical Research Department of the Nation of Islam, Chicago, Illinois. Copyright 2016 by Latimer Associates. All rights reserved. Published in audiobook form by the American Mercury with permission of the Historical Research Department of the Nation of Islam. Of the Nation of Islam. Of the Nation of Islam. Of the Nation of Islam.